Amphiola salamanders that you've seen in lab. You know, they have very small appendages. I think one could argue from the viewpoint of the mechanics of locomotion that those appendages aren't really accomplishing anything. But they still do have limbs, okay? In anguids, there are a couple of different evolutionary origins. So this has happened again and again and again and again. And what about in some other ectothermic tetrapod taxa? Can someone provide me an example? Yes?
Gymnophiona.
Okay, so we've got Sicilians as being limbless. Somebody else, another example. Either limbless or functionally limbless. Somebody else. Well, then we're going to wait. Hazard a guess. Think of different amphibian taxa that you've seen in lab.
The burrowing snakes?
Amphibians. Sirens have lost their hind limbs. They do have itty bitty front limbs. So Sirenidae. What else? I quickly mentioned it, so it should be easy to remember. Another salamander. Amphioma. Okay. All right. So we have a body plan that has not just arisen in snakes, it has not just arisen in squamate reptiles, it has not just arisen in reptiles, it has arisen independently many times in a whole bunch of ectothermic vertebrate taxa. But if you stop and think about endothermic vertebrate taxa, which includes what two classes?
Mammalian.
Right? You probably are hard pressed to think of limbless taxa, at least that look like a snake. So, take a minute, think about this question, and answer it. Ideas? Raise your hand if you've got an idea. Somebody else. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about like where they typically live versus others, but that doesn't, like they're not environment, but like.
Well, again, it's this distinction that I want you to focus on. There are actually plenty of burrowing mammals, right?
Yeah, that's what it's like.
Think of all the, ground squirrels, naked mole rats, a wide variety of roles, shrews, moles. Yes.
Maybe so they can expose their blood to the air more easily, so like they're more even heating. More like if they wanted to warm up, they lay in the sun and they were more evenly exposed.
What do you mean by even heating? I like the fact that you're thinking about heat transfer.
I don't know if this is right or not, but I was thinking like with a more elongated body and ectothermic vertebrates, because they get their heat from the outside source, maybe it's like with a longer body, there's more surface area that the sun is able to hit their body on, so they can get more heat back. Right? as opposed to,
Well, the amount of heat energy that something can hold is proportional to what? Mass, okay? It's got to keep track of units here. Mass, and you're talking about surface area. What about how one's related to the other? Because heat exchange depends, the rate of heat exchange depends on the conductance of the surface as well as, well, no, as well as radiators have fins to increase what?
Surface area?
Surface area. Put it all together.
So,
What shape has the least surface area for a given mass?
Oh. Is it
Pardon me?
Circle?
Well, if it's got mass, it's three-dimensional. Three-dimensional version of a circle is a sphere. Okay? Hence, any departure from that is going to have more and more surface area. The more elongate something is, the more it departs from the spherical shape, and hence has more surface area per unit mass, which means a lot of heat transfer is going to occur for a given unit mass because of the huge surface area. If you are using metabolic energy to generate heat, you would then have a heck of a time keeping up with that rate of heat loss. Okay? That's not the case with ectotherms because they're relying on external sources. Okay? So odds are this is something that clearly is in the mix, and it's also associated with certain ways that animals move. But it's interesting to ponder when something has evolved so many times in amphibians and reptiles, and for that matter, even fishes, and we practically never see that in endotherms, okay?
So it's because they're less able to heat their bodies that they can leave that sphere shape?
The problem is if you're using your energy that you acquire to generate heat, and if you have large surface area for your mass, you're going to lose a lot of heat. Hence, you'd have to really work hard. You'd have to have a very high metabolic rate to keep up with the amount of heat loss. A whole bunch of other factors being equal, right? And rarely are all those other factors equal, okay? Again, think of these relationships between structure and function, and a biggie actually has to do with heat transfer, as well as then some of the consequences for how different critters move. Well, if we go back to windlass reptiles and windlass squamates in particular, amphisbaenians are great at burrowing, but they're pretty crummy at doing about anything else. They're quite slow on surfaces for which other windlass reptiles would move rather quickly. They are also not at all good at climbing, and there's even some anecdotal evidence to suggest some amphisbaenians even have problems swimming, and that's a very ancient vertebrate ability that perhaps was lost. They've become so specialized as burrowers. There are a whole bunch of different functionally limbless lizards. I am not aware of any of them that are good at climbing branches, okay? By contrast, the more than 3,500 living species of snakes get all over the place, okay? But it's important to realize how good snakes are at moving in a particular habitat, using a particular behavior, depends on the taxonomic group. So it's commonly the case that a snake of a given species can move in a whole bunch of different ways when exposed to a whole bunch of different surfaces, okay? But there are some species that are more predisposed to using one type of movement than another. And once again, a lot of evidence would suggest if you get very, very specialized for some things, occasionally, doesn't have to be always, but occasionally, you can identify a cost towards other capacities. All right? So here's just a nice little animation emphasizing the snake body plan. As you've seen in lab, snakes have a heck of a lot of vertebrae. And this is going from, this is going from tail to head. This is a python. And what are these?
Legs.
Those are the vestigial legs. So remember, a bunch of scolicophidians and pedophidians are not completely limbless. They're functionally limbless with respect to locomotion, but they have these little claw-like structures commonly referred to as spurs on either side of the cloaca. Okay? So snakes have become long and skinny as a result of having a very large number of very similar size vertebrae, rather than elongating individual vertebrae. So an interesting aside is giraffe necks are long, not because they have a huge number of vertebrae compared to other mammals, but because each of their cervical vertebrae are very long. That's not the way that snakes have become long and skinny, and as a result of having so many joints, there's an amazing ability of snakes to deform their body and conform to features in the environment that they encounter when they're moving. Now, if we look at some of the major muscles that I believe you've seen in the lab, if you were to just peel the skin off of a snake, here's a right lateral view of a North American water snake. You see three big bundles of muscle. This yellowish tissue is actually the contractile tissue. But those longitudinal columns of muscles are actually made up of individual segments. So remember, a very ancient trait in vertebrates, and it actually precedes vertebrates, are segmented axial muscles. But unlike the myomeres of fishes, in snakes, besides having contractile tissue in a segmental arrangement, you see some very long tendons. And going from most dorsal to ventral for these three biggest muscles that often comprise more than 2/3 of the cross-sectional area of muscle in snakes are the semispinalis spinalis muscle, and that is adjacent to the neural spines, hence the name spinalis. The longissimus dorsi muscle, right here, and the iliocostalis muscle. The iliocostalis muscle actually attaches ventrolaterally to ribs rather than the vertebra. So you have muscles going from vertebra to vertebra and vertebra to ribs. There are a whole bunch of additional muscles we're not going to worry about that go from ribs to ribs and so on. Okay? So this is some of the infrastructure on the inside of the snake that allows them to move. And without going into a lot of the details, I want you to keep in mind that this is just a schematic illustration for one species. You see some tremendous variation in the lengths of these muscle segments. But most of that variation in the lengths of the muscle segments, it's not as if we just took this muscle segment and proportionately enlarged it to span more vertebrae. what happens in snakes that have muscles that span more vertebrae, which are represented by these vertical lines, is that they do so by lengthening the various tendons. So in snakes, you get some radical differences in the proportion of contractile tissue to tendon. In some boas and pythons and their relatives, that semispinalis spinalis muscle may only span about 10 or 12 vertebrae. In a blunt-headed tree snake from Neotropical America, a very slender arboreal specialist, that same muscle spans, believe it or not, 45 vertebrae. Think of a tendon that's nearly 40 vertebrae long. So a lot of variation that has, structural variation that has important functional consequences. Okay? So hopefully you've got handout 19 for quick reference for today's class. And I've mentioned, that different snakes can do different types of locomotion, and that depends on how fast the snake is trying to go, the surface that the snake encounters, and as I mentioned before, the taxonomic group to which the snake belongs. And furthermore, very often, just within a single species and within a single snake, you have an ability to perform many different types of locomotion, depending on these other factors, how fast it's trying to go and what the surface structure is. And the classical definitions of different types of snake locomotion are simply based on looking at the snake and how it moves. And that's referred to, kinematics is referred to describing the motion of a particular thing. And we'll be going into some of the details, but not only do the patterns of movement differ for different types of snake locomotion, so too we find different ways of using the muscles. And for the limited data we have, there are also some interesting differences in how much energy it takes to move a given distance. So let's sort of look with a broad brush stroke at some major categories of snake locomotion. There's one type of locomotion that's very distinct from all other types because it does not bend the vertebral column in order to generate propulsive forces. And snakes commonly perform this when their body is straight, although they can perform this when the body's bent. But because so commonly the snakes are almost perfectly straight when they do that, that's often referred to as rectilinear locomotion. In some references, you'll see that referred to as caterpillar locomotion, but caterpillars actually move in a different way, so that's not a very good choice of terminology. All other types of snake locomotion bend the vertebral column to provide the propulsive forces, including swimming via lateral undulation, moving on solid surfaces using lateral undulation, and sidewinding, as well as a number of types of concertina locomotion. I want to emphasize that for this and this, there's sort of a lot of variations on the theme. So if some of you are looking at resources online, just realize there are many things that fall under these sort of umbrella-like categories for characterizing snake locomotion. So let's look at some video clips just to sort of quickly give you an intuitive feel. If you just look at a snake and how it's moving, what does it look like? First off, with rectilinear locomotion, you very often see this in heavy-bodied species, such as heavy-bodied vipers and big boas, big pythons. This is quite a slow type of locomotion. And propulsion occurs when the skin is in static contact with the substrate. Namely, the skin during propulsion is not sliding relative to what it's touching. It is simply staying put. And we know how the muscles are used for this type of locomotion. Here's a big Burmese python where you can see the skin wiggling. And notice, even though the snake is bending some from side to side, it's the skin being moved to the skeleton that is actually propelling this massive Burmese python forward. Okay? And that's just a little diagram of some of the key muscles that we'll talk about later. And these muscles do not exist in any limbless lizards that I'm aware of. They go from the ribs, costo, to the skin, cutaneous. So this is above this one. This is the costocutaneous superior muscle. And this one going from the rib tip forward to the belly skin is the costocutaneous inferior muscle. So we actually see some anatomical structures present in snakes that we don't even find in all of those many windless lizards. There may be a muscle analogous to this in amphisbaenians, but that anatomy has not been well characterized. But amphisbaenians can actually do a form of rectilinear locomotion. We don't know how much energy this particular mode of movement requires, although we do know a lot of other details. We certainly should recognize things swimming with lateral undulatory movements. Think of what an ancient trait this is for vertebrates and even chordates, for that matter, where you have bending from side to side, and those bends are propagated from head to tail. Now, this is actually a sea snake in the family Elapidae, in the subfamily Hydropeinae. So these have deadly neurotoxic venoms. Notice this very specialized paddle-shaped tail. Many of these fully aquatic species of sea snakes are actually helpless when on land. Their anatomy has become so specialized. But I have never seen a snake yet that has been unable to swim. So the capacity to swim is not unique to sea snakes. It's just that sea snakes, many of them, are fully aquatic. Okay? Swimming can be reasonably fast. We also know how the muscles are used during this aquatic form of lateral undulation. Unfortunately, we don't know the energetic cost of swimming compared to some of these other types of snake locomotion. Now, lateral undulation can be used out of water as well as in water. And this is a little burrowing snake, called a shovel-nosed snake, found in the deserts of the southwest U.S. And notice it has this neat little banded pattern, which makes it very easy to follow different portions of the body as it moves along. Now notice when it's moving, every single point on the snake is moving simultaneously. The other thing to notice is this very tidy little trail that's left behind in the sand that conforms to the width of the snake. And that's because every single point along the length of the snake not only moves simultaneously, but all points pretty much follow the identical path through space. And so you get this neat little sinusoidal trail that gets left behind when they're moving on surfaces that can be deformed. Terrestrial lateral undulation can be reasonably fast. And as you can see from this example, everything along the body is sliding relative to the ground, rather than in static contact with the ground, as occurs during the propulsive phase of rectilinear locomotion. And this mode is most easily performed if there's actually stuff in the environment that the body of the snake can push against. Now, in this case, the snake sort of makes a little windrow of sand that the body can push against. But a lot of times where you'll see this type of locomotion is, say, if a snake is on a bunch of pebbles on the ground and it can push against those, push against branches, blades of grass, and so on. Where a wave travels along the length of the snake, but then it bumps into something solid that prevents that wave from moving, but the wave keeps traveling along the snake, and then the snake glides past that push point of a structure in the environment. So that greatly facilitates this type of locomotion. And we do know how the muscles are used during this type of locomotion. We also know energetically how expensive this type of locomotion is. Now, this type of locomotion, sidewinding, is often most confusing to folks because it looks like it just is something impossible, okay? Notice during sidewinding, as you can see in this side view of a sidewinder, there's actually some vertical bending of the vertebral column. So in sidewinding, not only do you have lateral bending from side to side, but we've got vertical bending up and down. And it's coordinated so that the snake has tracks that it leaves behind where the body is in static contact with the ground, but then it lifts its body up and forward to another contact region. So sidewinding snakes leave behind a curious series of tracks like this that are parallel to each other. They are oblique relative to the direction of travel, and those tracks are disconnected, so very, very different. And of course, different points along the body are traveling along different paths, and the paths traveled by these different points in the body would actually be parallel paths, rather than the same path traveled by all points along the body as occurs during lateral undulation. This can be performed rather slowly or quite quickly, and as I mentioned, the snake only has static contact with the ground. It is most commonly seen in these very open areas that are flat, and we know how the muscles are used, and we know energetically how expensive this type of locomotion is. Okay? So a combination of vertical and lateral bending, but only static contact with the ground when it touches the ground. And everything sort of happens so fast, that's kind of hard to see. But here you can see one of those tracks left behind. So this would be a region of static contact, and the snake is establishing the next region of static contact up here, where it makes that little crook in its neck. And notice how that region of static contact then travels along the length of the snake from the head to the tail. Okay? Now here's one of many types of concertina locomotion. All types of concertina locomotion are actually quite slow. And perhaps that shouldn't be too surprising, because in all types of concertina locomotion, the snake starts and stops, starts and stops. So in concertina locomotion, you actually see a combination of static contact and sliding contact. And this can be performed in a variety of circumstances. Shown here is a rather crazy apparatus. This is a view from this video camera over what amounts to basically a perpetual tunnel to make a little snake treadmill to study the energetics of this mode. Okay? And we know the energetics for this. We also know how the muscles are used. And in a nutshell, you can see that the snake scrunches up, forms an anchoring region that has static contact, and then extends, okay? So bunch up, extend, and as a result, the distance between the head of the snake and the tail of the snake varies periodically. And I don't know if you know what a concertina instrument is, but it's sort of like a little accordion where you push the ends in and out, and then the bellows make the music. Hence, it's referred to as concertina locomotion. I don't think concertinas are the most popular instrument, so that may not be something that you would otherwise readily know. So next, let's look at, okay, we kind of know how, we sort of know what the movement of the snake is. How are those movements accomplished? That's what we're going to delve into now as we look in a little more detail. So here's a little video clip. This would be a right lateral view of a boa constrictor performing rectilinear locomotion. And these dots are reflective markers along the middle of the back and along the side of the snake. And what's going to be very important is that you keep track of how this one's moving relative to these, okay?
The relevant muscles for this mode of locomotion are the constrictus superior in red, extending posteriorly and ventrally from the rib to the skin. The constrictus inferior in green extends anteriorly from the tip of the rib to the skin. And the fibers of the interscutalis muscle are in blue and confined to the skin, extending longitudinally from one ventral scale to an adjacent ventral scale.
So those are the three players as far as the muscles go.
The constrictus superior is active as...
This is a right lateral view. The snake was crawling on a transparent surface. So here's a simultaneous ventral view with some reflective markers. So the distance between these two markers is going to change periodically. And if you look at the position of these markers relative to this, that's going to change periodically as well. And then here we have electromyograms of that constrictus superior muscle, the constrictus inferior, and the ilioscutalis muscle. So remember, for EMGs, once again, where we see these vertical squiggles, that's where the muscle's electrically active. So we've got muscle activity here, here, and here.
The skin slides forward relative to the ground and the skeleton.
So notice how far forward at this point in time the belly skin is relative to a mark on the back.
The constrictus inferior is active during static contact.
And later on, that same landmark is posterior to that marker in the middle of the back.
The interscutalis first shortens the skin, and then isometric activity during static contact keeps the skin from being stretched during the propulsive phase.
Okay? So a key punchline of that is that the constrictus inferior muscle is pulling the skeleton forward over the belly skin while the belly skin is in static contact. So it's sort of like you have a sock over a skeleton, and the sock can be scrunched up and stretched, just as skin can be scrunched up and stretched. So that belly skin has big changes in the forward speed because periodically it has no velocity, and then it moves forward really quickly to get repositioned, and then it moves backwards relative to the snake as the skeleton is being propelled forward. Okay? So the constrictus superior has an antagonistic function to the constrictus inferior. Namely, it moves the skin forward relative to the skeleton in preparation for the next propulsive movement. And the ilioscutalis muscle, which is a muscle confined within the skin, overcomes the problem of the skin being stretched when these muscles are actually moving the skeleton relative to the skin. Okay? Now here are some electromyograms from the left side of a swimming snake. Does that look familiar?
Yeah.
Especially if I tell you the top one is nearest the head, the back one is nearest the tail. Where have you seen that motor pattern before?
This that use underlay.
Okay, in swimming fishes. Where else? In swimming salamanders. And how can you verbally characterize this motor pattern? It's an alternating unilateral pattern of muscle activity that is propagated posterior. Okay? Again, this is one of the reasons you spend a lot of time on fishes to see, keep in mind, by definition, all vertebrates have a vertebral column. Okay? So an interesting question to ponder during the course of evolution and all these different body plans, do different groups of vertebrates just keep doing the same damn thing with the same structures? Or do we see some departures from this very early vertebrate trait? Okay? Well, here are a couple of outline figures that you have on your handout 19 at the top showing terrestrial lateral undulation. The snake would be moving to the right in both of these figures. And in these experiments, these little black dots indicate discrete pegs that the body of the snake was pushing against. And then the black regions indicate regions where all three of those big axial muscles, the semispinalis, the longissimus dorsi, and the iliocostalis, are all active simultaneously at a given longitudinal location in the snake. But as you can see here, just as in the swimming of fishes, you have large regions of simultaneous activity in a whole bunch of adjacent axial muscle segments. So just as in fishes, you never see the activation of myomere 1, then myomere 1 turns off and myomere 2 is turned on. Myomere 1 stays on so long that its electrical activity overlaps with the next myomere and so on. So you have these big blocks of axial muscle segments that are simultaneously active, and in fact, they're propagated from head to tail for lateral undulation on land. And as you can see, at a given location in the body, you only see activity on either the left or the right side, since we refer to that as unilateral activity. And furthermore, as was the case in swimming fishes, activity at a given longitudinal location alternates between the left and the right side. However, for terrestrial lateral undulation, we see a constant timing relationship between activation of muscle and whether the fibers are long or short. For terrestrial lateral undulation, the overall pattern of activity is that muscles are only electrically active when the fibers are being shortened. And that holds along the length of the entire snake. So since this is a posteriorly propagated motor pattern, on the left side of the snake, as seen in this dorsal view of the snake, the muscles are just turning on there, and the muscles opposite are just turning off here. okay? So you see this transition between activity on one side and the other at regions of maximal bending. Remember when you stood up and bent back and forth like this? This corresponds to the muscle activity during shortening, okay? And as I mentioned, those three big muscles, for all practical purposes, at a given longitudinal location are simultaneously active, okay? Here's what's going on in a swimming snake. Is a swimming snake doing all the same stuff as a snake doing terrestrial lateral undulation? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Same thing. Who says no? Raise your hands. Okay, if no, then what's different?
It's not at the max concave or convex point where it switches.
Okay. And what about along the length of the whole snake? So actually that transition between activity on the right side and left side anteriorly in the snake is very near a region of maximal bending, right? Not so much here, definitely not there. That's almost straight. So just as in the swimming of fishes, you have different speeds of propagating muscle activity in the wave of bending. Namely, muscle activity is propagated faster than the wave of bending. So the farther back along the length of the snake you go, the more muscle activity you have when the fibers are actually lengthening. And such activity, as in swimming fishes, can stiffen the body to help push against the water and use drag-based propulsive mechanisms. So there are a ton of similarities between terrestrial lateral undulation and aquatic lateral undulation, except this shift in the timing of muscle activity relative to bending because of the different propagation speeds of those two events. So the swimming of snakes, nothing special. We've seen that time in, time out, a whole bunch of fish, all different kinds of fish, different shapes of fish, eels, bass, you name it. They do fundamentally the same thing. Swimming salamanders do the same thing. And we see the same thing, it's simply retained in snakes. However, this type of locomotion that superficially looks the same has this important difference. Namely, there's just muscle activity during shortening. The snakes use this type of locomotion and they're moving past solid surfaces. Okay? So, some things are the same, some things are different. Okay? Now, for sidewinding, you may think that's just a lost cause. I'm never going to understand how the damn snake can bend this way, that way, and move all over the place. But actually, once you understand terrestrial lateral undulation, it's pretty easy to understand sidewinding locomotion, even though at first glance they may appear to be very different. So actually, a whole bunch of the muscle activity in sidewinding snakes is just the same as terrestrial lateral undulation. So if you remember what's going on in terrestrial lateral undulation, for these big blocks of muscle that are indicated in black, where all three of those epiaxial muscles are active at the same time, you pretty much know what's going on in sidewinding, except, and here's the big except, notice that little gray region is showing activity when the opposite side also has activity. So here we have an evolutionary innovation in motor pattern. Instead of just being unilateral, that semispinalis muscle has bilateral activity. And that bilateral activity arches the back. That's what lifts the snake up off the ground. And as a result of the timing of lifting the snake up off the ground relative to lateral bending, that's how you get that really crazy looking pattern of movement, where these shaded areas would indicate the tracks that the snake would be leaving behind for a snake moving in this direction. Also notice in sidewinding, you can have a posterior part of the body actually leading a more anterior part of the body. And for all practical purposes, you never see that in terrestrial lateral undulation. Okay? Well, we also have another way of moving. Concertina locomotion has been best studied within the confines of tunnels. You've got this illustration in your handout. These stippled areas indicate static contact with the surfaces. These horizontal lines are the sides of the tunnel. Of course, there was a floor of the tunnel that the snake was contacting. The black areas indicate regions of muscle activity. And unlike all of these other axial motor patterns, we do not see a motor pattern that is propagated consistently from head to tail. So that's something that's pretty radically different if you think of how common propagated motor patterns are in ectothermic vertebrate locomotion. However, notice that all these different locations along the length of the body, we only see muscles active on one side or the other. So we do have a unilateral pattern of activity. But we also don't see a consistent alternating pattern of activity. It's just all over the place, okay? So some of the activity is involved in straightening the body and thus pushing the body forward from a region that is anchored by static contact as a result of the snake pushing against the sides of the tunnel, okay? But also, you see some muscle activity here and here where the snake is bending and hence pulling the more posterior region towards a region of static contact. Now, both of these types of muscle activity would involve shortening of the fibers. But then we see something else that's new in concertina locomotion, namely where that snake is jammed against the sides of the tunnel. The shape of the snake doesn't change, but there's prolonged muscle activity when the snake is vigorously pushing against the sides of the tunnel. Remember, just as I'm preventing my arm from dropping right now, hence there's no change in fiber length in my biceps muscle, that's an example also of isometric activity. Iso means same, metric means length, same length muscle activity. Okay? So this is a highly variable motor pattern compared to those other more stereotyped motor patterns. And it would appear that a lot of what's going on is when the snake simply starts bending and then it bumps into a region, that provides some feedback that says, okay, now I bumped into this side, now bend the other way, you bump into the other side, you bend the other way, and so on. Okay? Now I mentioned that the energetic cost of some of these modes differ. One way of determining the energetic cost of aerobically sustainable speeds of locomotion, that's very important that they're aerobically sustainable, is to measure the oxygen consumption when the animals are moving. A recurrent finding when you do that for many types of animal locomotion is if you make a plot of the rate of oxygen consumption versus locomotor speed over a region that's aerobically sustainable, as the critter goes faster, you get a linear increase in oxygen consumption. And that's a mass-specific rate of oxygen consumption. Here you have units of distance per unit time. If you look at the slope of that, you actually get units of energy required to move a given unit mass, a given distance. That's called the net cost of transport, commonly abbreviated NCT. Now, as it turns out, that net cost of transport is quite high in very small animals and quite low in very large animals. There's some complicated scaling relationships between metabolic rates and net cost of transport. And those measurements have been made for some very small lizards and some pretty sizable lizards. And they nicely demonstrate that effective size. So when you compare these things, it's very important to standardize for size. But if we look at lizards and snakes that are 100 grams, notice that for a 100-gram snake doing terrestrial lateral undulation, the energetic cost is statistically indistinguishable from that of a lived lizard. This is presumably the ancestral limbless pattern of locomotion. Therefore, the notion that snakes lost their limbs because it conveyed energetic economy is bogus. Because the energetic cost of terrestrial lateral undulation is identical to limb locomotion. However, a very interesting thing about the locomotion of snakes is that sidewinding locomotion is really economical compared to lateral undulation. And concertina locomotion, which perhaps shouldn't be too surprising because of all the starts and stopping. Think of the gas mileage for in-town driving versus highway driving, same thing, lots of accelerations, decelerations. Energetically, very expensive. So hopefully you've gotten an idea of some of these important functional differences of different types of snake locomotion. That's it for reptile material. We do have mandatory classes tomorrow in lab beginning at the regular time. I'm going to cover 1 unit of lecture material, so we stay on pace. After I do that, I'm happy to have a review session for as long as that seems appropriate. And after that, if anyone would like to see some of the snakes in my lab, I'll take you upstairs so you can do so. Okay, so make sure you show up on time in 411 Revachel tomorrow for lab, which won't be lab, but it'll be other stuff.